Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss digital news. This lecture is part of your paper News and Society. The production and consumption of news has grown and diversified tremendously today with the ubiquity of internet and digital technologies. Putting information and analysis about the latest events across the world is literally a tap away on our smartphones. The modes and forms in which we access news have expanded, where apart from prominent news websites, social media, aggregator sites and apps also form a significant part of the digital news landscape. With more than 40-50 independent Indian news aggregation apps, both in the English and non-English segments, and every prominent print and broadcast media house establishing an online media presence, the market for digital news seems to be expanding rapidly, but it has come with its own challenges nevertheless. While there are new digital startups entering the marketplace every day, the transition to the digital has also meant challenges in terms of infrastructure and funding, and a shift in the imagination of content and editorial strategies to optimally leverage the potential of the digital medium. This lecture will provide an overview of what constitutes digital news today, the factors that have promoted its growth and consumption, and what such a transition entails for news media more broadly. Now, let us first start with the history of digital news. The transition to the digital medium for news media, like all other media forms, has often been seen as a revolution due to possibilities of wider outreach, better revenues, and innovation in terms of content, among many other advantages. While the growth of online journalism has definitely led to remarkable changes in the content and the structure of news production, circulation and consumption, it has also made more explicit some of the issues that plagued traditional forms of media, illustrating that the digital cannot be understood in isolation. Ben Scott, in his overview of the growth of digital journalism in North America, offers several insights into the changes that the advent of digital has meant for journalism at large. He talks about the contradictions between the democratic objectives of journalism, which focused on creating a public sphere that encourages debate and dissent, to one that is now largely determined by the commercial interests of a growing marketplace, overseen by specific economic and political agendas. This has affected not only the quality of content being produced, but also the growth of the industry and the imagination of a free and fair fourth estate at large. With the digital turn came the anticipation of a remedy to this state of crisis, which had really come to a head in the 1990s with the first commercial web browsers, Netscape in 1994 and Microsoft's Internet Explorer in 1995 came opportunities for news to go digital as well, and soon in the next 2 years most news outlets, print as well as broadcast, had a web presence. The benefits offered by digital platforms were too many. As Scott describes, content was grouped topically, often presented as a list of headlines and leads with a hyperlink directed to the rest of the story. Toolbars allowed quick linking to a different section of story from the main page as well as between pages deeper in the site. Users could drill down into the depths of a story by following intertextual links to find follow-up and related material from that day or from previous days. Most online sites archived the news, producing essentially a massive database of information easily accessible to users via direct hyperlinks or via search engine. Linking between the reports on the same story over a period of time was just as easy as linking between headlines. Using the unlimited space available on the web, context, primary documentation, and original web-only commentary could be added to the standard news. Editors also quickly actualized a 24-hour news cycle, publishing breaking news instantly, scooping print and broadcast sources and their slow production process. Other unique digital features debuted, such as web boards, chat rooms, and opportunities for readers to interact directly with the journalists themselves. Options to customize the main page of news site to individual tastes were also quick to develop, as were features that emailed out headlines and breaking news to registered readers. Such a diversity of options appeared to be a user wonderland. Add multimedia to this mix of possibilities and the digital news looked to be just the revolutionary force its champions had predicted. They were also enticing little matters of lower production costs and a promising climate for advertising and commerce. Publishing the news on the web costs roughly half of delivering print copy. Despite these many obvious advantages, the digital news industry itself was not profitable, foreshadowing the boom and the bust cycle of the internet seen in the early 2000s. With wires such as APB and Reuters, portals like AOL and Yahoo functioning as aggregators, the rise of web-only news outlets and non-profit and independent ventures driven by volunteer labor entering the fray, legacy media houses had to look towards more beneficial ways of driving business. Now let us look at the history of digital news. The main issue here was of excessive supply, of seemingly free content, fueled also by a growth in citizen journalism, leading to a cut in subscription-based and advertising revenue. This led to the rise of a number of trends in the digital news industries, which have continued till today. As Scott points out, the new media business model that has turned the trick relies on two central elements. First, restructuring the production of news to use technology to cut costs, and the development of multiple micro revenue streams that are insignificant on their own but sustaining when taken together. Tellingly, neither of these changes has anything to do with improving the quality of the content. These changes include newsroom convergence, cross-media content sharing, and digital news networks, which sought to widen outreach but lower costs. Partnerships with content carriers, micropayments such as exclusive services, pay-per-view or subscriptions, and charging for premium content are other forms. Advertising remains one of the largest sources, but is also the most difficult to stabilize. The impact of these on content is apparent, as news has become more personalized and is actually a customization service which reorganizes a limited set of stories based on consumption patterns and advertiser preferences. Scott finds these patterns reflective of an already existing crisis in journalism, which is reflected in the growth of some problematic trends. Primary among these is the growth of shovelware, or reproduction of content that appeared in a news organization's primary distribution channels. Secondly, economic and political pressures that led to poor content in print or broadcast were also prevalent in online media. Thirdly, the rise of commercial ownership and business strategies that owe allegiance to advertisers and stakeholders instead of people. These include content sharing via corporate partnerships, intra-firm digital news networks, and multimedia newsroom convergence practices most common to a handful of impressively large companies with cross-media holdings. Such trends have continued to exist and have in a way come to define the forms of digital journalism that we see in practice today. Now let us look at this new form of journalism that has emerged, known as citizen journalism. An important change and possible opposition to some of the trends noted by the digital news industry, as pointed out earlier in the lecture, is the increase in citizen partnership in the way news is gathered and disseminated today. And this has broadly taken two forms: social news and citizen journalism. Luke Good discusses both of these phenomena, which have several similarities and importantly various implications for democracy and the public sphere. Let us first try and understand citizen journalism. According to Luke, citizen journalism refers to a range of web-based practices whereby ordinary users engage in journalistic practices. Citizen journalism includes practices such as current affairs based blogging, photo and video sharing, and posting eyewitness commentary on current events. Sometimes the term is used quite broadly to include activities such as reposting, linking, tagging, rating, modifying, or commenting upon news materials posted by other users or by professional news outlets, whereby citizens participate in the news process without necessarily acting as content creators. In other words, the definition of citizen journalism does not have completely settled boundaries. Unlike popular presumptions, citizen journalism is not restricted to only the internet or digital interactive media alone. Broadcast and print media have also incorporated forms of it, although it seems to be very visibly associated with the online space. This also gives it a certain connotation of being an alternative movement in opposition to the mainstream press. But this notion of alterity is relative. Large mainstream media corporations have also successfully integrated citizen news practices with their own. Most importantly, a dichotomy seems to have emerged between citizen as creator of original content and practices such as rating, commenting, tagging and reposting, which may be dismissed as meta-journalism. Taking this a step further, collaborative forms of engagement with news such as crowdsourcing with an emphasis on process of circulation, reworking and interpretation, the viral mutations in digital parlance of public information and discourse seem to be in conflict with a more historical narrative of heroic citizens performing the labor of seeking out and disseminating news. This reflects also a tension in the imagination of journalistic practices which are focused on its revelatory aspects, although it is also largely to do with interpretation, meaning making and re-articulation. Citizen journalism, social news and forms of meta-journalism should not be dismissed as separate from real or authentic forms of journalism or newsmaking, as they are part of a larger chain of the production and distribution of news. Good instead suggests situating these in a larger framework of mediation which accommodates different practices of news making. By doing so, he says, it can be argued that citizen journalism constitutes a complex and a layered mix of representation, interpretation and reinterpretation, translation and indeed remediation, whereby news and comment, discourse and information is reshaped as it traverses a range of sites and varying media platforms. In this sense, then whether the meta-journalism of social news sites can be considered part of citizen journalism depends upon whether a broad or narrow definition of citizen journalism and indeed journalism per se is adopted. He further sees the importance of citizen journalism as well as social news in agenda setting, and not only by producing original content but by also making existing processes of established professional media somewhat transparent and open to critical intervention. The notion of gatekeeping, traditionally performed by media personnel, opinion leaders, and censors, which all help to shape the parameters of public discourse, becomes important here, especially in the online sphere. With venture capital, larger scale corporations, advertising revenue, and commercialism in general becoming important factors in citizen journalism as well, it remains to be seen what new forms of gatekeeping emerge in this digital environment. Good further points out the need for critical research on issues such as informal, organic, and potentially fluid status differentials within citizen journalism and meta journalism networks, drawing on power hierarchies and gatekeeping which impact processes of news making and agenda setting. As such, citizen journalism and social news continue to remain an important and steadily growing component of digital news. Now let us first take an overview of digital news globally. The Digital News Report 2016, published by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, offers new insights about digital news consumption based on a YouGov survey of over 50,000 online news consumers in 26 countries, including the US as well as the UK. The report suggests that publishers across the world are facing unprecedented levels of disruption to business models and formats from a combination of the rise of social platforms, the move to mobile, and growing consumer rejection of online advertising. Some of the key findings of the report are: across the entire sample, half say they use social media as a source of news each week. Around 1 in 10 say it is their main source. Facebook is by far the most important network for finding, reading, watching, and sharing news. Social media are significantly more important for women, who are also less likely to go directly to a news website or app, and for the young, more than a quarter of 18 to 24 say that social media is their main source of news, more than even television. The growth of news accessed and increasingly consumed via social networks, portals, and mobile apps means that the originating news brand gets clearly noticed less than half the time in the UK and Canada. In countries like Japan and South Korea, where aggregated and distributed news is already more widespread, the brand only gets noticed around a quarter of time when accessed through news portals. Television news still remains most important for older groups, but overall usage has continued to decline, particularly for appointment to view bulletins and amongst younger groups. Most consumers are still reluctant to pay for general news online, particularly in highly competitive English-speaking world. But in some smaller countries protected by language, people are twice as likely to pay for their news. Business problems for many publishers have worsened, with the rise of ad blocking, which is running at between 10% in Japan and 38% in Poland, but much higher amongst under 35s and people who use news the most. The vast majority of those who have ever downloaded a blocker are using them regularly, suggesting that once downloaded, people rarely go back. Only around 8% of the smartphone's users currently use an ad blocker, but around a third of the respondents say that they plan to install one on their mobile in the next year. Trust in news is highest in Finland, which is 65%, and lowest in Greece, where it is as low as 20%. Almost everywhere, editors and journalists are trusted less than the news organizations. There are strong concerns that personalized news and more algorithm sections of news will mean missing out on important information or challenging viewpoints. Having said that, the report also finds that young people are more comfortable with algorithms than with the editors. Media companies that have nailed their colors to a distributed future like BuzzFeed are gaining ground in terms of reach. But these new brands and platforms are mostly used as secondary sources and for softer news subjects. Main usage online remains with brands that have a strong news heritage and have been able to build up a reputation over time. The report also mentions a contradiction in its finding, where publishers are losing control of distribution, sources of content not being an issue for consumers, and a growing influence of platforms and algorithms. Traditional brands are still very much in demand. The report attributes this to individual context and types of news, or to a complex relationship with a particular brand. It also offers these possible methods of negotiating the challenges of the digital landscape, which are A. Delivering constantly with a strong audience focus, B. Have a clear identity that matches the content proposition, and C. Excel at distribution in a fast changing environment. Managing quality of content, especially in the case of aggregators and social media, and generating revenue within difficult online environment where content is distributed. Mobile phones are becoming ubiquitous, and there is a growth of ad blocking. All adds up to finding a sustainable business model for digital news. At the same time, trying to preserve integrity, trust, and brand equity. Now let us look at the digital news in India. The digital news market has expanded rapidly in India over the last few years, with even legacy media houses now transitioning to the digital in terms of content and structure of news production, and journalistic practices also changing significantly as a result. As we discussed, news organizations and audiences in different parts of the world are slowly moving to digital platforms and modes in various ways, and this is connected to context of growth of the internet in these countries. The Mapping Digital Media of India report sees some important developments in the growth of digital media, namely the switch over from analog broadcasting to digital broadcasting, growth of new media platforms as sources of news, convergence of traditional broadcasting with telecommunications. It further notes that 60% of all households that have cable and satellite television, providing access to many of the 700 plus television channels licensed to broadcast, and it becomes clear that in garrulous India, mass poverty and marginalization do not result in a perfect digital divide. This, together with the fact that the public broadcaster's prime terrestrial channel DD National covers about 92% of the 1200 million plus population, clearly suggests that the users of digital technologies in India include many of the 300 million still below the official poverty line. So, beginning with the digitization of terrestrial transmission of the state-owned broadcaster Prasar Bharati, the growth of the C&S television and the increased penetration of the internet, especially with better access to mobile phones, the transition to digital forms of news has been an important one. The report, however, also cautions that despite digitization, there is an absence of specific laws on ownership, cross ownership, or consolidation, or an overarching regulatory framework either for media infrastructure or news content, except for licensing norms for broadcasters and distribution and foreign investment caps in new media. These factors have led to a number of changes in the media landscape, with several competitive trends such as breaking news and even practices such as paid news and private treaties persisting in the digital domain. The internet being a different and a difficult regulatory space, it is likely that these challenges would be exacerbated with its growth and expansion in India. As pointed out by an RISJ report on the digital transition in newspapers, in India, it took 15 years from 1995 to 2010 before 100 million people had internet access. But since 2010, growth in internet access has accelerated, in large part due to the rise of the mobile web, and by 2016, some estimate that around 30% of Indians have some kind of internet access. Digital media are now rapidly changing the overall media environment in terms of how people find information, engage with public affairs, and entertain themselves, and in terms of where advertisers invest their money. The report further notes how different factors determine the entry and sustainability of legacy media houses in the digital space, where they have advantages of brand reputation, loyal audiences, large newsrooms, and revenues from existing operations that can be further invested in new initiatives, but also liabilities such as combination of organizational inertia and a professional culture invested in the perceived superiority of existing products over the new alternatives. As a result, organizations have taken a defensive approach, trying to replicate online news that is primarily meant for print, which has led to problems like shovelware. There is a need, therefore, to develop more digitally native approaches and methods of news productions, which remains a challenge even for large media houses today. Now let us look at the digital news startups to understand better how news media landscape is evolving today with advancements in technology that have led to new editorial priorities, distribution strategies, and funding models, as suggested by a report on digital journalism startups in India 2016 by Reuters Research Organization. The report growth in internet use and digital advertising has been accompanied by large number of new startups, including both for-profit content-based startups, aggregation-based startups, and non-profit startups. There are more new and interesting experiments in Indian journalism than in most other countries in the world. Most of these startups recognize that internet use in India is overwhelmingly and increasingly mobile internet use, and as a consequence prioritize mobile first approaches based on mobile optimized websites and mobile apps more than websites for desktop internet users. While many are currently primarily serving English speaking Indians, most are keen to move into Hindi and local language content to reach a wider audience as more and more Indians come online. In terms of distribution, most of these startups recognize they are unlikely to be destination sites or apps for large number of users at this stage and have prioritized social media distribution to build reach and engagement. Content-based startups and non-profits alike use social media to promote and distribute their content. Aggregation-based startups have focused on using social media to market their apps. Some of these startups have grown very quickly in terms of reach, engagement, and numbers of users, but they increasingly face head-to-head competition with both A, the digital operations of legacy media when it comes to news content, and B, large international technology companies including search engines and social media, especially for attention and advertising. Sustainable business models take time to build, and it is too soon to judge the prospects of the startups examined here. But it is clear that the combination of low advertising rates, limited willingness to pay for news, and the dominance of legacy media and international technology companies when it comes to digital advertising means startups in India face a challenging environment, even as they benefit from rapid growth in number of users and in overall advertising spend. As the report highlights, an analysis of these startups provide a good insight into the digital media landscape in India, especially in the light of better access to internet, especially now with the pervasiveness of mobile phones. According to IAMAI, figures quoted in RISJ report, as a percentage of the total population of 1.2 billion, about 30% of the Indians are internet users, well under the global average of 40%. And there is a huge digital divide due to poverty and urban-rural divide. However, the pace of growth has been rather rapid, expanding from a third of internet users in India, accessing it via mobile phones in 2012 to an estimated 60% in 2015. Despite limited infrastructure delaying better access to 4G connectivity and home broadband, interest from telecommunication providers and private companies such as Facebook and Google is high, and with initiatives like Digital India, it will grow further, aided by falling handset prices and data tariffs. The estimate is that mobile internet users will comprise at least 70 to 80% of India's total internet users by 2018. The massive internet growth is also indicative of an expansion in digital advertising, which explains the growth in business opportunities for digital startups in India. At an estimated 62.5 billion rupees, digital advertising in India grew by a factor of 10 between 2008 and 15 and is expected to continue grow by 20 to 30% a year in the immediate future, says the RISJ report. There are also several players in the market, ranging from the legacy media houses like Times of India, NDTV and Dainik Bhaskar, international technology players such as Google, Facebook and Amazon, and international media houses such as New York Times, the Wall Street Journal and the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. The report also highlights some specific features of the Indian digital market, such as the comparatively low average revenue per user in terms of digital advertising. It is only $2.5 per internet users compared to over 5% per user in China in 2015. The reference price for news and media content in India is very low compared to other countries, as a result of which it is difficult to get people to pay for digital news. And lastly, like most of the Europe, but unlike for examples the United States, India does not have much of a tradition of domestic philanthropic support for news and media. Digital news startups, as the analysis of these startups reveal, most have developed distinct profiles to carve out a niche space for themselves in an increasingly competitive market, and have adapted to digital platforms in terms of content, both in terms of long form, in-depth articles and documentary videos, and in greater volume in terms of more transient short form content flowing across websites, apps and social media channels in a steady streams. These trends are not unique to online startups only, but are also reflected in the digital outputs of many newspapers and broadcasters. There are challenges that RISJ report can foresee. For instance, content-based for-profit startups like the Quint and Scroll, which increasingly faced head-on competition from legacy titles in terms of branding, editorial strategies and technologically prowess. Further, there would also be stiff competition in terms of generating revenue through advertising. In the case of aggregation-based startups like InShorts and Daily Hunt, there would be competition from global technology companies with similar or comparable services entering the Indian market and overcoming hurdles such as better access to data and cheap smartphones and increased English literacy. Digital startups are still mostly restricted to urban English-speaking audiences who are also technologically literate, so their impact beyond barriers of caste, language and the urban-rural divide, especially in a country like India, needs to be assessed. The curation of digital news, especially with the prevalence of algorithms and computational models and maintaining quality in terms of sound reporting, is an important aspect of the growth of this sector, as also putting in place sustainable models, and that to do away with undue commercial or political pressures on journalists. Now let us try and summarize what we discussed in this lecture. Digital news consists of various forms of news productions ranging from online transition of legacy print and broadcast media houses to web-only news sites, aggregators, social media and apps. Citizen journalism and social news forms significant part of digital news. Digital media offers different possibilities of reporting and presenting news content, and therefore demands new approaches to creating content that keep in mind the potential offered by the medium. The growth of the digital marketplace is closely tied to the pervasive rise of the internet, but comes with several challenges in terms of sustainable models that are free of economic and political pressures and strive to preserve the democratic objectives of journalism. Funding and other resources remain a key issue the world over, including in India, but digital startups have also thrived due to several distinct features that give them an edge in the competitive world of online journalism today. As a result, digital news has grown in strength and comprises an integral part of the digital media landscape of India today. We hope that the lecture helped you in understanding the digital news status in India. Do attempt the question in the self-evaluate quadrant, and for further reading suggestions, please refer to the third quadrant. Thank you.